Thank you so much for coming out to our first TrinityU lecture of the 2020-21 school year. I'm so excited that you've decided to join us under these wonderful lights out here in the courtyard. You're in for a treat tonight. We have our new Dean of Classical Education, Zach Weichbrodt, who's going to be speaking to us about the definition of classical education and what love has got to do with it. Zach's been at our school for quite a long time now, over a decade, right, Zach? And he has recently become our Dean of Classical Education. He's been the chair of the Humanities Department for our upper school. He's been the founder of our senior thesis program, which is such a cornerstone and highlight for our upper school, especially for our seniors. And he's been doing good work in the trenches with sophomores in their medieval literature class for many years too. TrinityU, if you are not aware, is our effort to share what is so great about what's going on in those walls with our community beyond our students, with our families, with our friends, grandparents, and our local community. We are really all in on our vision of classical Christian education, what that means, and the way it can transform us in our minds and our hearts. We think it's too good to just keep all to ourselves in our four walls. So we want to offer that to our community as a way to encourage and inspire and allow continual intellectual growth for the people around Trinity, our supporters. In addition to these lectures, we also are at this point having a podcast. We had our first season last year with about 6 episodes. A lot of them introducing different aspects to what classical education is all about, looking at questions like science in classical education. Can we do that? Or does classical education actually prepare you well for a STEM career? Spoilers, yes and yes. And looking at the history of classical education, wondering who killed classical education and how it came back to life in the 20th century. Things like that are conversations that we're having on the Classical Academy podcast. That's the name for it. You can find it if you search the iTunes podcast channel. You can also find it on our website. Our own Dr. Keith Bueller is our host. He's terribly engaging. And the whole idea is that it's the friendly guide to the world of classical education. It's supposed to be very fun and engaging and opening us into these topics that we're talking about for classical education. This coming season, we are going to be looking at this Cardis report, this report that was done in association with the University of Notre Dame's sociology department, where they looked at these alumni from classical Christian education schools and compared them against alumni from public schools, private schools, Catholic schools, private Christian schools that are not classically affiliated, and even homeschoolers, and looked at different criteria that parents really care about for their kids. Are these students prepared for college and careers? Are they people that continue in their faith? Do they end up having happy marriages? Do they engage with people that have opposite views from them? And the results were almost unbelievable. On every single metric, the classically educated students were far and away better prepared and living these lives out than any other model of education out there. They actually had to double check the stats to make sure they hadn't messed it up, because it was so significant and so shocking. And yes, the stats were solid. And so there was a one last final podcast episode about that. But for the coming season of the podcast series, we're going to be digging into that report even further, because we think it's such dynamite stuff that we're going to go through each of these criteria, and we're going to look at our own alumni and ask, is this what we're seeing in our own alumni, people that go through Trinity and they graduate? Does this match up? And we're pretty sure it does, but we're going to find out from the alumni themselves, how are they living out these ideals of classical Christian education. So look forward to that coming up on the podcast, but we're here tonight for the lecture with Mr. Weichbrodt. Let me pray and I'll hand it off to him. Heavenly Father, we thank you and praise you that you are the source of all goodness and all truth and all beauty. We ask tonight that you would open our eyes so that we could see your truth and beauty and goodness anew and that we would understand how we could seek it and how we could seek it in our children's lives through the form of education that we are pursuing here at Trinity. Please give Zach the words he needs to speak and give our ears openness to hear those words. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Shay. It is a pleasure to be here with you all tonight on such a lovely and romantic evening underneath the stars, and we can pretend the tent doesn't exist behind us and just enjoy the mountains and the surrounding landscape. It's always a pleasure to speak to an audience of the Trinity community, near and extended, because this is a community which I like to think of as dense in the best possible way, which is that the folks who come out for events like this, the people who continue to engage in our community, are folks with tremendous influence in their own spheres, whether it be how they lead their families, or how they parent, or the particular vocations that they have. To be able to speak to anyone in the Trinity community is to speak to someone who tends to have an outsized influence in their own worlds. And so even a smaller cohort like we have tonight is a wonderful opportunity that I'm very glad to be able to take advantage of and speak to this evening. So I want to start by asking, what is the image of education that exists within your soul? When you think about education, what is the picture that encapsulates your experiences? Is it maybe a memory of the past, that first day that the cool kids invited you to sit at their table for lunch? Is it that feeling of welcome and warmth that your second grade teacher always greeted you with every day going into the room? Is it maybe the success that was emblazoned with a bright red A on a paper that you turned in? Maybe a challenge or a failure that you experienced? When you think about your own life, what is the picture that you have of what education is? If we go beyond the personal, if we go beyond our own experiences, we might graduate the question to, what is a symbol of education to you? Not something that necessarily describes your own experience and your own thoughts, but something that exists outside your own personal experience, your own personal history, and speaks to what education is, not just for you, but for everyone. Those symbols tend to proliferate. Education being a pretty important thing, we manufacture lots of images and lots of symbols to try and encapsulate this thing that we spend so much time and money and effort and blood, sweat, and emotions into for ourselves and for our children. Perhaps one of the most common symbols for education is that education is like a passport. It guarantees that you've come from some place that's credible, that's worthwhile, and gives you entry into the places that you want to go. There's a certain kind of authority that it confers upon you, and therefore a trust that you deserve to be admitted into these better, higher, and greater opportunities. And perhaps as you get more and more of it, there are more and more stamps that signify that yours is a life well-traveled, well-experienced, well-versed, lending you some kind of authority. And while this image, this symbol, does seem to have some value, right? It certainly seems to speak to the practical uses of education. It certainly seems to speak to our personal experiences, I'm sure, of needing to be able to put forth a credential to somebody who wants to hire us or is a gatekeeper for our opportunity into something else. That also seems pretty limited to explain, again, all that we have invested in education, if it's just a key that happens to unlock some doors. And if you've ever been in that position of interviewing or hiring someone, perhaps you've also had that experience of seeing something on a piece of paper and wondering, what can I actually know that you know because of this degree that you have or this credential that you possess? What is that actually going to translate into that I can trust and rely on whenever I make this hiring decision? Maybe another common image that we have is conveyed by the famous phrase, education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. Now this seems to have some natural attractions, right? We all know today that computers are far better information receptacles than human beings. And if education is simply a matter of knowing stuff, there's a lot of things that we can buy for a pretty cheap price at this point in human history that contain information and organize it far better than any one of us could individually. Education has to be simply something more than accumulating content when there's other vessels superior to human minds for that kind of activity. And that idea of education is lighting a fire, right? Sparking the curiosity that will then drive us towards higher and more, right? We imagine the flames lifting up to the heavens, our own minds ascending and ascending, driven by that desire to know. There seems to be something true about that. But at the same time, you don't have to be a Californian in the year 2020 to know that simply a fire burning is far from a particularly attractive or beneficial outcome. That without direction, that without purpose, that without shaping, it's the kind of thing that can have drastic and dramatically negative consequences. So what I want to propose to you today is 4 different stories or 4 different images that illustrate what education is from the classical and Christian perspective. 4 things that we can hold in our minds to explain and project forward what this thing is that we're doing at Trinity and at schools all across, not just the country, but the world, in classical Christian education. I've been talking for long enough now that I can give you a definition without it being a rookie mistake. So, our word education comes from the Latin word duco. And even though there's kind of a long, complicated etymological history, one of its clear roots, education, comes from this Latin verb that means to lead. And when we add the complicated part at the beginning and at the end, we get the word educere, which means to be let out of or led away from. Education, educere, to be led out of or led away from. And on its own, that might seem like a very curious idea to encapsulate what we mean by education. And yet there's also maybe some initial sense that can start to make to us. That education is a process where we go from X to Y, A to B. And that idea of being led, that there is some guide who is leading us along a way that we should go, not simply trusting to our own natural bent and curiosity, but directing us along a way that has been made, prepared, and gone down before by those who have come before us. And even more, the idea that what we need to be led away from isn't just a place of greater ignorance or less skill or capacity, but even a self that needs to be led out of. That education is a process of transformation that takes us where we are and makes us into something greater and better who God has intended for us to be. Now, Hugh of St. Victor, who is a 12th century theologian and writer, expresses this in a famous phrase that gets spun out in a variety of formulations. But he writes that the entire task of education is the restoration of our nature and the removal of our deficiency. The restoration of our nature and the removal of our deficiency. What do we need to be led away from? What do we need to be led out of? Something in the human nature that is marred by sin, marred by ignorance, that can grow into something that through God's grace can transform us into being like Him, to bear truly that image which we discarded through our sin, and to become the image of what we're promised in the gospel, Christ. And when we think about the idea of education as the transformation of the self, a question logically follows. What has the power to transform you from what you were into what you should be? What has the power to shake you out of yourself and your comfortable habits and your familiarity and your way of thinking about the world and engaging with it? And the answer, then, simply, is love. Love has always been talked about as the kind of thing that has the power to change us from what we were into what we are or will be or should be. Maybe whenever you saw the title for this talk, you thought that this was going to be a version of C.S. Lewis's famous work, The Four Loves. And I wish I could give a version of that talk nearly as well to do Lewis justice. But in that work, he talks about one of our words for love, eros. And originally that word, eros the erotic, didn't mean something that was strictly sexual, but rather meant something that was romantic in a classic sense. That feeling you get whenever you take that final step up the summit of a mountain and you see a vast vista spread before you, and you get goosebumps, and you catch your breath a little bit because you can hardly believe that you're in a place of such beauty that you feel almost outside of yourself, drawn out of yourself by the sight of what is before you. That, Lewis points out, is the classical idea of romance. Not necessarily a meet cute of boy meets girl, but rather that experience that is powerful and compelling enough to draw us out of ourselves and into something that is unknown but beckoning towards us, something with a powerful enough attraction that we would leave, as the Bible says, our father and mother and cleave to that which is new and unknown and other. That's the power of romance. That's the power of love. And for education to have that transformative effect, therefore, we must see how it's animated by love. And so, having offered that initial answer, we should also remember the words of Tina Turner. Well, what has love got to do with it? Now, we're all lucky. One maybe unexpected blessing of the pandemic is that I'm pretty sure that I'm not allowed to sing to you tonight. I think the outdoor concerts are still prohibited under county health orders. So I'll just do my best William Shatner spoken word version of what Tina Turner reminds us of. What's love got to do with it? What's love but a second-hand emotion? What's love but a sweet old-fashioned notion? Who needs a heart when a heart can be broken? Now, even though in the original song, these are the words of somebody experiencing those powerful butterflies of first sight and the meet cute, and trying to reason herself out of it, right? Trying to talk away that feeling that she has and say, no, it's not anything more than just a physical attraction. It's not anything more than just this feeling in the moment. You can't confuse me and bamboozle me and trick me one more time, love, into making more of this than what it is. There's many ways in which these lyrics, I think, express some concerns and fears and prejudices that we have about education. What's love got to do with it? Aren't we just talking in education about something that's physical, the practical satisfaction of our needs and wants, the ability to make our way into a good college, or have our kids make their way into a good college so they can get a good job, so they can buy the kind of lifestyle that will be acceptable and familiar to us or our neighbors or our family or our friends? What's love got to do with it? Aren't we just talking about maybe some fancy sentimentality, right? Emotions or feelings that we can dress up, but ultimately are going to be nothing more than just that, window dressing that we apply towards maybe a fancy, sophisticated, elite experience that isn't actually something within itself that is real and substantial. Or maybe we might even be persuaded by some more recent arguments and claims about classical education. Isn't this something that is obsolete, something that we should leave in the wayside, maybe because it has nothing to speak to the way that the world is today? Or perhaps even more critically and harshly, is this classical Christian education maybe just something that's responsible for the perpetuation of a status quo where those who have power want to perpetuate it and seek to exploit others and put others down and retain their grasp and hold? And so that's why we want to talk about things like the great books or the Western canon. What's love got to do with any of that? So with those objections in mind, I want to give us these 4 ways and 4 stories that show us what love has to do with classical Christian education. The first is classical Christian education is about a love of heritage. Now, this is maybe the most obvious love or the most stereotypical love, right? Classical education is about loving the old stuff, those things that are dusty and ought to be left behind. But the image that I want to first present to describe this love for heritage comes from the great epic, the Aeneid. Rome, like any great empire, loves to tell stories about itself, either about how awesome it is or how inferior everyone else is. And the Aeneid, Virgil's classic work, is no exception to this. But in it, the story of Rome's greatness starts from a humble place, even an unlikely place, the destruction of the city of Troy. In some ways, it might seem odd for Rome to take such great pride in tracing back their ancestry to the losers of one of history's most famous, if perhaps mythical, conflicts. And so the Aeneid zeroes in near the beginning of its story on the Trojan prince Aeneas. After the Greeks have just cowardly deceived and tricked their way into the previously impregnable walls of Troy, hidden inside the belly of a wooden horse that they had offered as a peace gift going away to their ships. Aeneas is first driven by rage and despair, desperately fighting with all the men that he can find to inflict something of their wrath and pain at losing the city that's burning all around them on those who have brought this destruction to their shores. But soon after that assault is turned back, Aeneas turns back to find his home, and there he sees, amidst the legitimate blaze that is consuming the walls, consuming the houses, his own father, grasping the gods of their household, these invocations and symbols of divine aid to protect the home and give it flourishing, gods whose strength and power was clearly inadequate to the task of preserving their home in this moment. And his father desires nothing more than to perish along with his city. And so Aeneas has to persuade him that there's still something more for them, and takes his father on his own back to lead him out of the burning city, and takes his own young son, Ascanius, by the hand, and together, father on his back, son in his hand, leads them out of the blaze. This image of a father bearing a grandfather, holding a son, has been memorialized time after time in art, perhaps most famously by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in his sculpture, which if you're ever in Italy again in the future, I encourage you to devote significant time to enjoying. But this picture speaks to what exactly the love of heritage is for classical Christian education. The first reason for why we love our heritage is because we must know it in order to know ourselves. For the great task that Aeneas is engaged to found the most glorious empire that the world had ever seen, he has to first know who he is. And who he is, who each of us are, is formed in ways that we can't imagine by where we come from. The philosopher Mark Mitchell writes, "We are shaped necessarily by the traditions that we inhabit." Whatever story that you've experienced or can imagine of teenage rebellion, right, the details of that story are always going to involve somebody rebelling on the terms that are dictated to by the culture that they're rebelling from. Right? You have to rebel away from something that is already set, that's already established. And so in some ways, even your act of rebellion is predicted and set by the very thing that you're trying to rebel away from. Right? It's the compass that sets the 180-degree turn that you want to make. Even if we want to fight against our heritage, we have to first grapple with the ways that we are formed by it, first of all. This is the classical inclination, that we ought to have the humility to look back to the past before we have the presumption to dismiss it. Even if we think that it's something that should be fought against, even if we think that it's something that needs to change, we need to look back to it first to understand ourselves before we flail futilely in any attempt to grow beyond it or grow past it. To say nothing of all the good things that we might grab a hold of that could continue to flourish and grow in our own lives. Paul reminds us of this when he speaks of all of the things that we have as Christians as being gifts. Right? He writes to the Corinthians, "What do you have that you have not received?" He's speaking specifically of the gospel here, right? None in the Corinthian church invented the gospel or figured it out on their own or added to it. Everything that they had that gave them new life was a gift that they received. And though what's true of the gospel may not be true in the exact same way of many of the other goods of life, this seems to also ring true. The goods that we have are not goods because we made them or fashioned them for ourselves, but because they were given to us, and we cultivated them, we stewarded them, we nurtured them into being something of growth and richness in our own lives. Aeneas in that moment also speaks to another classical impulse, that things will die unless we hold on to them. The past won't always be with us. Perhaps you've had that experience of a parent or a grandparent and sitting near them and hearing their stories, maybe time and time and time again. But whenever that person passes on, unless you chose to hold on to that story, to make it your own, to tell it to yourself, to tell it to your own children, how many stories have been lost? Because we simply assumed that they would always be there for us, that their wisdom or their wit would always be a presence in our lives. And yet, unless we grab a hold of them and make them our own, they're going to pass away, and all the good that they contain and communicate goes with them. As Aeneas recognizes in Troy, the past will literally burn unless we seize it out of the fire and bring it forward with us. Again, we tend to have, especially in a technological age, the presumption that whatever is good and in the past, we have in version 2.0 or 3.0 or 4.0. That somewhere in the build history, somewhere in all of that is contained anything that's good, and so it doesn't take any effort on our part. That whatever is good surely is at the forefront of our minds and our attentions. And yet, as one of my favorite bits of historical information reminds us, we still don't know in all of our success in engineering how the Egyptians built the pyramids, the means by which, given the technology available to them at the time, they are able to discern and construct these things that have endured for thousands and thousands of years. An age as skilled in engineering as we are still has no idea what the secret of the past was, because it didn't survive. And so one of our classical impulses is always to reach back and to grab a hold of and bring forward those things which might otherwise be lost. This accords clearly with what Scripture reminds us time and time again. If you look back to the Old Testament, how many times does God command his people to remember, to remember, to remember, to remember, to remember what God has done for them, to remember what God has taught to their fathers, to remember how God has revealed himself to them. All of these things for the Israelites, all of these things that as Christians are a part of our heritage, while they might be renewed, while they might be manifested in new ways in our lives and in our experience in our age, they're given to us in Scripture as things to remember, to hold on to, and to carry forward. We believe as Christians that God is actively at work in history, that God is revealing himself through history, that he is guiding all things towards their proper end, which is his glory, and that he's always remaking what is new from what is old. For all these reasons, as Christians, we ought to look back and to take careful stock of those goods and riches that we might have there. We can think of no further than maybe the most dramatic reshaping of the world, Noah and the flood, to realize this principle, that even though God makes things new, and unimaginably new and unimaginably good, he does so by means of the old. He doesn't wipe out a people and institute a new one. He remakes from them, reforming them and refashioning them. Perhaps a wonderful image of this is in the Japanese art of kintsugi, where a tea vessel that has been cracked after years or decades or generations of use isn't thrown away, isn't consigned to a dustbin, but is instead kept and preserved until an artisan has the opportunity to remake it, to fill the crack with a lacquer or a substance derived from a precious metal, and so makes something that is not broken, but whose initial brokenness gives the opportunity for a beautiful work of art to refashion it to a new and greater glory. The Japanese Japanese-American artist Makoto Fujimura writes this in a reflection on speaking at the anniversary of the Columbine shooting. He says, "As an artist, I know that our imagination and our brain's neuron pathways give us many generative ways to deal with our past. It matters what we do with these remembered images. The imagination can cause hatred to expand or create empathy in the world, create weapons of mass destruction or beautiful paintings. Imagination can turn gold into an idol of a calf. It can take good gifts of God and warp them into narcissistic snares. It can forgive, or it can be hardened to remain bitter. Our imagination can rewire how we view ourselves and our past." He continues the thought and asks, what kind of cultural language allows us to honor our past, but to bring the new into our days? And this is very much the task and the project of classical Christian education, to hold on, to preserve, but to also fashion anew what is broken, to know what might need to be left behind and what might need to be filled in with a purer gold. A love for a heritage doesn't mean that we celebrate all of it or desire to stay stuck in it. In the case of Aeneas, he bears the past for the sake of his future. He carries his grandfather for the sake not just of him and his mission, but for the son who he holds by the hand. And the piety of the Rome that he found is not the piety of Troy. Even though his father bears his old household gods with them, the religion of Rome is not the same as what they left behind. In fact, Aeneas recognizes that in addition to the will of the gods, the tragic failures of the leaders of Troy contributed to their downfall. And so the heritage of Rome is founded acknowledging and seeking to correct those mistakes of the past. That it can be honored, it can be treasured, it can be preserved, but it need not be slavishly followed, and in fact can inspire something greater and more enduring. St. Augustine gives us a picture of this in his commentary on Exodus chapter 3, commenting that as we see the people of God streaming out of the Egypt that held them in bondage, they carry with them not just a cloak, not just a staff, but gold and silver, and even household servants who chose to follow this people into the path that God is clearly leading them down. And Augustine reflects on this. This is an image of what classical Christian education seeks to do, to plunder what is good from the pagans, to take what is worthwhile and refashion it so that it might serve true worship and might serve the ends of the people of God. So even though we have respect for this heritage in classical Christian education, we need not worship it, in fact can recognize that it provides us with stuff that in some cases might need to be melted down and reforged and refashioned in order to be what it truly ought to be. So, classical education is driven by a love of heritage. To know ourselves, we must know where we come from. We assume that the past is not a place of darkness, obscurity, or irrelevance to our lives, but that there are treasures there that we ought to cherish, and that what needs to be made new will be made new from what comes before. The second love that I want to argue describes classical Christian education is a love of the transcendentals, a love of goodness, of truth, and of beauty, or a love for what lasts and what lies beyond us. And a great image for this is found in the life of the great statesman Boethius. He demonstrates that driven by a love for what is transcendent, in the end he is able to, through his life and his words, bear witness to the worth of these things, which stand above but not disconnected from the turmoil of our lives. Nicius Manlius Severinus Boetius, how is my pronunciation, Mrs. Parsons? Adequate? Was known as the last of the Romans. He was born into the last dying breaths of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. And even though he was orphaned as a boy, he was given the rare opportunity to receive a rich and strong classical education, which he seized for all that it was worth. And so, in addition to becoming one of the few in his day who could read Plato, who could read Aristotle because he knew Greek, a language which had fallen into kind of disuse and even despite amongst the Romans, he became good at pretty much anything that you could learn to be good at, one of history's true polymaths. As the Roman Empire continued to decline far away from the glory that it once was, Boethius had the intellect and capacity to bring forward from the past what was actively being neglected and forgotten, and helped inspire a movement that, even though it didn't revive Rome, ended up being carried on into the Middle Ages and into the rise of Christendom. The barbarian king of Rome at the time, Theodoric, also employed Boethius in a wide array of tasks, recognizing the capacity and genius that his classical education had given him. He conducted diplomacy to foreign kings, invented machines to tell time, investigated corruption in the royal court, and set the music program for visiting dignitaries. Boethius was also a staunch defender of the Christian faith, earning a reputation as he wrote against the heresies that bedeviled the church in his time. But this reputation that he had for capability, for wisdom, and for virtue quickly became a target on his back, as he was falsely denounced as a traitor while preventing some other conspirators from actually committing treason. So as he sought to keep the traitors from committing treason, he was denounced as a traitor, and without an opportunity to defend himself at a trial, was condemned as guilty, was exiled, and was sentenced to death. So alone, exiled from his family, his reputation in ruins, stripped of all of his possessions, facing execution, he began to wonder, how did I get here? How could I live a life of virtue? How could I live a life aimed at the good of my community and end up thought to be a betrayer of everything that I stood for? How could God look on and allow this to happen to someone who has served him so faithfully? What is virtue if all it leads to is destruction and ruin? Why bother living a life for anything more than just pleasure and comfort, when to seek that which is beyond leads to such a dramatic, stark, and painful end to what is here? And so, he did what all the rest of us would do when faced with these questions. He took down a pen and he wrote one of the greatest works ever known in human history, the Consolation of Philosophy. And in this, he imagines, personifies Lady Philosophy, an embodiment of all that he has pursued and learned, patiently, wisely, and insightfully encouraging him beyond his state of emo depression and into, once again, being the person who strove to understand. Facing death and facing the loss of everything that he loved, Boethius continues to strive to know. Beneath the Bible, this work, the Consolation of Philosophy, became one of the most widely translated books up through the early modern period. Kings and queens of Europe considered it a privilege and a royal responsibility to transport its ideas into their own language and into their own times. What greater acknowledgement could there be of the usefulness of the fruits of classical education? And these questions that Boethius asks of what the world is, who God is, how does he rule over things, and what meaning our life and pursuits have, stands as an example of how in the midst of pain and shame and loss and even death, we can still be driven to know. It is the glory of man, he writes, to be able to lift our heads against the shackles of circumstance that bind us, to set our eyes above the whirling dust of pain and pleasure, politics and celebrity. The glory of man to seek that which is real, lasting, and outside of ourselves, the ideas which animate our brief lives and even endure beyond them. Truth, he affirms, despite all appearances, is not in mere appearances, the majority opinion, or defined solely by the decisions of the powerful. Goodness is not a matter of deceiving and tricking others into holding a certain reputation of you. Beauty is not in the mere achievement of our desires or in our self-actualization or contained by what can be ripped from us by the ever-changing tides of life. So where does he turn to find these things which transcend? He turns to a conversation, and he turns to books. Why on earth would he turn to those as sources for what is lasting and enduring? Well, again, from a Christian perspective, we affirm that we live in a world that is made by words. When God chose to create out of his abundance and fullness of love, he spoke, and out of that speech, our world was made. In order to redeem us and bring us salvation, he spoke a word, his Son, into the world to redeem all things back to himself. And he gave us a word to make our own little worlds, to be a light unto our feet and a guide unto our path. In the Christian tradition, we affirm that words make worlds. And so it is to them that we turn when we want to affirm what is truly real, and again, beyond mere circumstances and opinions. He turns to a conversation because he recognizes that in the act of speech and the act of conversation, we are constantly assimilating the world that we perceive into words, fashioning it, and offering that world back to that person that we speak to, who does the exact same process. And in so doing, back and forth, drawing us closer to one another, building community, but also, by the grace of God, drawing us closer and closer to that which is real, his word and his world. Books enable us to have these kinds of conversations, especially the books that have endured, especially the books that speak to these things which last, and because of that testimony themselves last and endure. We don't read the most popular books of the Roman era or of the Elizabethan era. Many of those have been consigned to the dustbin of history, and in some cases, rightly so. But instead, we read and continue to regard those things which have been preserved and carried forward because they speak towards something which is lasting and enduring and has something to say to every age. We also do so to make sure that we aren't beholden to the prejudices and the snobberies of our own time. Again, we always fall victim to the fallacy of presentism, that whatever's important is surely right here and right now, is surely something that we can see and know and is visible to us. And yet, as G.K. Chesterton famously calls, books invite us to participate in the democracy of the dead, where it's not only those who happen to have the fortune of being alive at that moment in time can speak to us and point us to a wisdom that might be lost or obscured in whatever age we might happen to inhabit. Another wonderful example of this is the chemist turned philosopher turned social scientist Michael Palandi. He was a chemistry professor who ended up teaching 3 students who each won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And yet, living in the middle of the 20th century, realized that in order to do the work that he was called to do, he should turn from chemistry to asking, why has Europe torn itself apart? Why has this apex of civilization fallen into such disrepair, chaos, and ruin? And all of this work that he had done in physical chemistry seemed to be dwarfed by the importance of asking, beyond dealing with these states of matter, about the ideas that passed through this age and led this time and place to such horrors and darkness. And so, In part, in the midst of his career revolution, he also participated and started a bunch of reading groups, conversations with eminent figures like Max Planck and Albert Einstein and Arthur Schrodinger and T.S. Eliot and Reinhold Niebuhr, where instead of dealing with whatever pressing matter of the day demanded their attention, instead of responding to whatever government leaders or university professors or business leaders who were engaging their services wanted, they instead read great books and talked about them. And these ended up being formative cradles that launched the careers and inspired many future subsequent scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers. In many cases, as classical education reminds us, what is actually the most practically beneficial seems the farthest from it whenever we engage in that practice of slowing down and reading and talking. A third love that animates classical Christian education is the love of freedom. Perhaps there's no better exemplification of this than the story of Frederick Douglass, who, as an enslaved young man in the 19th century, began the process of learning how to read in the house of a master who believed that literacy would forever unfit him to be a slave. This common prejudice and in many cases enshrined law prohibiting slaves to learn how to read had some obvious merit behind it if wielded in the hands of one who would seek to oppress others and keep them down. But the animating idea behind this was not simply that in learning how to read, a young Frederick Douglass would gain skills that others would want to, say, pay him for to be employed and therefore loosen the hold that his master had on him. Education, even as Frederick Douglass acknowledged, was not simply about developing useful skills that would enable him to rise above his situation. Douglass's education allowed him to recognize who he was as a human being, a thing fundamentally unfit for slavery of any kind. And this is reflected in our idea of classical education as being liberal. Now, liberal has a variety of meanings, just a few of which we'll spell out here. One of which is that classical education is defined by the liberal arts. 7 specific arts which once learned comprise the classical corpus. One bonus to this is that if classical Christian education is about 7 arts, that means there's only 7 subjects that we have to learn. The profusion that we have today of subject after subject after subject is certainly not a thing that we see in the classical tradition. And the idea behind these 7 liberal arts is that whatever we might learn to do as humans that's worthwhile is an art, is an imitative habit that produces something fruitful and enriching to human life. And again, we see in that definition some connections to what we've already said. An imitative habit that produces something enriching to human life. An art is something which you gain from someone else, and you cultivate by consistent and dedicated practice that manifests itself in good fruit that improves the human condition. These were divided into 2 sets, the Trivium and the Quadrupium, which dealt with encountering, in the case of the Trivium, reality through language, and in the case of the Quadrupium, reality through number. Recognition that God has made our reality, God has made our world composed of shape, number, and word. So if we have the goal of engaging and accessing reality, we better learn shape, number, and word. And indeed, that idea that education is about enabling us to see and connect with what is real is part of what it means that education, classical Christian education, is about freedom. The freedom to be connected to what is real. Now, one simple meaning of classical education as the liberal arts is that these are the arts fit for a free man. If you were fortunate enough to be born into one of those families in Greco-Roman society, right, who had the privilege of the city and would need to become skilled and developed in all of the things that the city valued, you would then get a classical education. You would get good at the things that would enable you to be a productive member of society. And indeed, that conversation manifests itself in American history, as during the Reconstruction era, men like Frederick Douglass, or later after him, W.E. Du Bois, argued about what sort of education the black community should invest in order to repair the ruin that they had been plunged into by their social conditions and circumstances and make a way forward, against some figures like Booker T. Washington, And this conversation manifested in a conflict about the liberal arts versus the practical arts or the industrial arts. And while there are a whole host of attendant issues, and it's certainly historically a little bit of a sin, forgive me, Mr. Ramquist, to talk about Booker T. Washington as solely advocating for the practical arts, the question of what does this community need? Do they need the stuff that's going to get them a job and a more esteemed place in society? Or do we need the things that everyone else has thought that they needed? Shouldn't our education match the kind of education that those who lead society have also had? And so Frederick Douglass and Du Bois after them were tireless advocates for the need for a classical liberal arts education for the black community, not just in order so that they might attain a certain position of status and esteem in society, but because they recognize that education is about freedom, a freedom that's not conferred by a legal status, but conferred by the shaping of a mind to be able to engage with what is real. A freedom that's not circumscribed by material circumstances or practical ends, but paradoxically often has the effect of achieving just those things when properly pursued and ordered. In fact, studying this whole train of historical debate, the economist Gregory Price writes that we can see some of the consequences of the way this debate was concluded in the absence of liberal arts curriculums in many historically black colleges and universities. He writes, a coercive vocationalist curriculum, a curriculum that's solely designed at giving an education to get you a job or to achieve a certain kind of professional success or certification, can result in the best and brightest of our students being driven away from, say, molecular biology and perhaps discovering a cure for AIDS, and steeped into vocations such as marketing, where they learn to write proposals for marketing and selling colas to select demographic groups. Oftentimes, in the name of practical interest, we consign ourselves and others to a far less noble and wondrous end that could be achieved, and in turn often fails to actually achieve those practical goods that we aim at. A corollary to this is that liberal arts isn't just then the education fit for a free citizen, but are themselves the arts that fit a human for freedom. We study the liberal arts because through them we ourselves become free, enabling us to engage reality by the means through which God has chosen to make that reality. Consider, for instance, the classical example of the liberal art of mathematics. For the first, say, 2,500 years of the development of mathematics, no serious mathematician would ever make the mistake of saying that math had anything to do with the real world. The greatest mathematicians and innovators of the art of mathematics, in fact, had the opposite prejudice. Why look in our material world around us to learn anything about mathematics? Because mathematics is about the purity and harmony of number, and we just see a lot of kind of messed up sorted patterns in life. But it was the pursuit of mathematics, not as a gateway to a STEM career, that inspired Pythagoras and Euclid and many of the other great innovators to discover things which in many cases it took centuries to discover a practical value for, but once discovered, ignited tremendous technological progress in our world. We now have the opposite error, where instead of looking for mathematical truth and mathematical reality, we simply look for what works. In their excellent work describing the liberal arts classical Christian tradition, Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain write that contemporary modern science has a pragmatic view of knowledge, as in the instrumentalist or nominalist view of knowledge in quantum physics, where what is true is what works. The ancients believed that real things had really intelligible essences and knew that what works in one situation may not work in another. They therefore sought more substantial justification for their knowledge. Unless we believe that there is a reality and truth out there that animates what we're able to make stuff do through technology, we'll quickly lose our ability to discover those very things if we allow ourselves to be restrained and constrained simply by being satisfied with what works. And indeed, this points to a truth that the book of Proverbs reminds us of, that it is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. God has made the world that is real and can be accessed, but only if we have an education fit for a king, fit for someone who is full of freedom and able to engage with that reality. Classical education is driven by a love of freedom. And the result is a curriculum that seeks to fit us to encounter reality and become kings and queens guided by wisdom, seeking and seeing the glory of God in himself and in what he has made. This reminds us of also embracing historical truth, that history is full of classically educated monsters. History is full of classically educated nothings. People who received something like this and either squandered their lives or turned it to no useful advantage for themselves or the kingdom or any of these greater and higher goods that we've been discussing. As Paul reminds us, none of these great abilities that we cultivate through classical Christian education are worth anything unless they have love. And this, in fact, concords with the most classical idea of what freedom is. The philosopher Michael Sandel writes that to be free is to participate in self-rule. To be free is to participate in self-rule. We have a contemporary prejudice that to be free means the absence of restrictions. Freedom is the absence of constraints. And while that particularly in the time of COVID, that might be a very attractive idea as we all chafe under various kinds of restrictions and obstacles, there is something that we should recall in the danger of an unrestrained flame if education is simply the lighting of a fire. Perhaps the greatest classical example of this is the Athenian Alcibiades, who is the great philosopher Socrates' best and brightest student. And like some of these other figures that we've looked at, anything that you could be good at or want, Alcibiades had. Whatever you could envy in another man, Alcibiades had in spades. He was better looking than you, he was smarter than you, he came from a better family than you, he was more clever than you, people liked to be around him more than they liked to be around you. And such a person with such amazing talents, for some time dogged Socrates' steps, demanding to know what this great master would teach him about wisdom. But notoriously, Alcibiades was unable to rule himself, and lived a life essentially enslaved to his own fears and desires, and living in a time when many looked on him to be the great golden hope that would revive Athens, that would place down their enemies and lead them to a new golden age. When the critical moment came, Alcibiades led them to defeat, betrayed them to their greatest and worst enemies on multiple occasions, and ended up living a life of dissipation and disillusion, at times being exiled and condemned for blasphemy from his home city, because all of the skills and talent and ability in the world meant nothing for a man who was unable to rule himself and was instead enslaved to his own desires. The classical tradition reminds us that if these transcendentals exist, if there is beauty, if there is truth, if there is goodness, if they are real and they exist outside of ourselves and our own definition, then there are proper objects of love. There are things which we ought to love, and there are things which we ought not to love. If there is beauty which must be loved, then ugliness must be rejected. If there is goodness that must be embraced, then there is wickedness which must be destroyed. If there is truth which must be known, then there is falsehood which must be renounced. And even when we acknowledge the danger of falling prey to loving something that is not a true and fit object of love, there are still further dangers that we must be trained and formed to avoid, such as loving too little what is most worthy of love, or loving too much what is little worthy of our loves. A classical image of this is the poet Dante, who was inspired in his life by the beauty of a woman named Beatrice, who became his beloved and inspired him to a career of civic success, of poetic excellence, and some of the best writing a human has ever produced. And yet, though he had been given, Dante believed even by God himself, the image of something worthy of his love, even having such a worthy thing is tremendously difficult to sustain faithfulness towards. And so in his life, Dante found himself falling away from this great image of beauty which was unimaginable to something which was lesser, to something which was easier, to something which didn't demand quite so much of him, and tumbled from a life directed towards the glory of the height of beauty to being content with shadows and shadows, until he tumbled in his own poetic autobiography, lost into a dark wood and threatened by his own fears and vices, even to the point of death, to the point where he realized the only way that he could save himself was to travel through hell, rise up the mountain of purgatory so that he could once again be fit to see the beauty whose sight he had earlier scorned in his life. This epic journey, known as Dante's Divine Comedy, is in many ways a picture of education, of what it means for us to be properly formed so that we love what is most worthy of love, so that we can ascend to achieve our true end as humans, to see and delight in the glory of God. And it is through conversation. It is through the experience of art. It is through song. It is through the cultivation of virtue that Dante's soul becomes reformed from the deformation that he plunged himself into something which is capable of experiencing and communicating the great glories and beauties of human existence. His salvation in the story is a matter of education, and it's for that reason that classical education aims at a holistic education, not simply giving intellectual skills and virtues, but acknowledging that humans are whole souls, and for us to pursue these goods of heritage, of the transcendentals, and of freedom, we must love them. And we must love them over and above all the other lesser loves which might draw our attention. So, what's love got to do with it? Well, hopefully, I've convinced you in some small part that love has everything to do with it. The classical education is animated by a love of heritage, a love of the transcendentals, and a love of freedom. That it aims at the shaping of our loves so that we become more and more like the one whose love made us and whose love moves us, along with all the glories of this world and the one to come. Thank you.